How you doing, everybody? I'm Mr. Mazzoro. Today we're going to leave our conversations about population ecology behind, and we're going to start talking about community ecology, how plants interact with each other or other organisms in their ecosystem. We're going to start talking about competition, what plants compete for, and what that actually looks like. And then we're going to talk about how plants defend themselves, avoid becoming prey, avoid getting eaten. Lastly, we're going to move on to how plants interact with other organisms in their ecosystem, how they live closely with them, and in some cases so closely that they're interwoven, their lives depend on each other in some way. And last, we're going to learn the differences between keystone and dominant species in an ecosystem, how plants become ecosystems, and how they in some cases become the most important organism in their ecosystem. Competition is an interaction between two or more organisms, in this case plants, where they're competing for the same resources. Since both organisms are competing for the same thing, and there's only so much of it to go around, they both suffer. Plants specifically compete for things like food, light, water, and you can see that actually in this sort of cartoon drawing of a jungle. Some plants grew super tall, but they're top heavy, they can snap in the wind. Some plants are much more sturdy, closer to the ground, but they're not very large because they're not getting very much light. This plant's getting more light, but it's unsteady. These plants are getting less light, but they're more steady. There's in between. This idea of organisms competing for light, plants competing for light in this way, this would be competition. This plant and these plants and all the other plants in between aren't necessarily growing as well as they otherwise could because they're too busy competing for what little light it is. And that competition means they're excluding their developmental energy from developing things like flour or strong wood or any number of things, and instead they're just concentrating on putting it all towards getting as much light as they can. Plants also are predators and prey. When something consumes another organism, it's a predator. And plants avoid predators in a number of ways that you'd never really thought of. The number one way they avoid predators is actually chemicals. Now, we call these chemicals drugs, but these are actually poisons that plants have developed to kill things. It's just that we're a lot bigger, usually, than the insects that eat those plants. Things like opium, things like marijuana, things like nicotine and tobacco, things like caffeine in tea and coffee. All of those are chemicals that plants have evolved to try to stop insects from eating them. When insects consume those chemicals, they seize and die or have heart attacks and die. We are not insects, so when we eat a coffee bean or we don't seize and die, we just get hyper. Another way is thorns. Some plants, like roses, produce thorns. Another way is leathery leaves, thick leaves that are hard to eat and munch on. Magnolias, for instance, do this. These are all defense mechanisms, common defense mechanisms that plants use in order to fend off their predators, usually insects, but in some cases humans. Protective chemicals, thorns and spines, leathery leaves. Plants have been defending themselves against predators for so many years that actually predators, insect predators and plants, many of them have co-evolved into each other in a sort of evolutionary arms race. The classic example of this is monarch butterflies. This is a monarch caterpillar, and it's eating a milkweed leaf. Obviously, the milkweed leaf doesn't want to be eaten by the hungry monarch caterpillar. So, initially, milkweed leaves evolved a poison. They evolved a poison to avoid getting eaten by monarch caterpillars. This killed most of the monarch caterpillars, although some it didn't. And those monarch caterpillars lived long enough and had babies and eventually became butterflies, monarch butterflies that had more babies. And what you got was a group of caterpillars that's now not only immune to the toxin, but when they eat enough milkweed, they actually become toxic themselves. And it's actually better for them to eat the milkweed because it's a defense mechanism. So milkweed said, okay, chemicals aren't doing it. Why don't I produce a glue? So they did. They developed latex, which now literally glues a monarch's mouth shut or suffocates them in this kind of rubbery goo. Monarch caterpillars responded. Over time, most of them died, but some of them didn't. And the ones that didn't learned that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to eat the central vein. And when you eat the central vein of a leaf, all that goo is extruded out that one main artery, and you can eat the rest of the leaf just fine. So milkweed didn't say anything. I mean, it's a plant. But in response to this said, okay, fine, can't beat 'em, join 'em. What did it do? It evolved to be pollinated by a monarch butterfly. So there you go. One organism, milkweed changing, spurs a change in another organism. That organism changing spurs a trait in the previous organisms, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Predators and prey co-evolved with each other. In this case, plants co-evolved with and against their predators. Symbiosis is another way plants interact with organisms in their ecosystem. Only now, instead of being eaten, they're going to live closely together. They're going to have a relationship with each other. Such a close relationship, in fact, that they're almost never found individual in an ecosystem. These symbiotic organisms are almost always found together. There are three types of symbiotic relationships that plants can have with either other plants or organisms. The first is a mutualistic relationship, mutualism. This is a symbiotic relationship where both organisms in the relationship benefit. Here's a passion flower and an ant. The ant actually gets nectar from the passion flower. In return, the ant defends the passion flower by non-pollinating insects that aren't other ants. Now, that ant doesn't get nectar direct from the flower. It actually gets nectar by nectar glands that are closer to the leaves and leaving the nectar in the flower for pollinators. So both organisms are benefiting. Ants get a sugar rush, and passion flowers get a bodyguard defending them against non-pollinating insects. The next symbiotic relationship is commensalism. A relationship where one organism is benefited and the other isn't hurt or benefited. It just exists. It's there. This would be the example of a bird living in a tree, right? Birds live in a tree to get off the ground so their babies aren't eaten, but the tree doesn't care that the bird's really there. Another good example of that are epiphytes. You find a lot of epiphytes actually in the tropics. These are organisms that would grow in dense rainforests, but what they do instead of growing on the ground is they've evolved to grow on other trees, branches specifically, higher up where they get more light. These epiphytes get more light, they're benefited, but the trees they grow on completely unaffected. So that's what makes this commensalism. Parasitism is a symbiotic relationship where one organism, the parasite, benefits, and the other organism, the host, is harmed. Here is a butterfly, and the butterfly looks like it's pollinating a pretty flower, but if you kind of know what you're looking at, you know that this isn't a flower at all. This is actually a mushroom. This is a parasitic fungus that inhabits plants and literally kills them, takes them over. And out from the top of that plant, once the plant is basically completely dead, comes a portion of that fungus that produces spores, but looks just like a flower. And it even produces a smell that smells just like the flower that it parasitizes. As a result, that smell and that look is so convincing that actually pollinators of that particular plant will actually come and land on it and try to pollinate it, thus spreading the parasite around. Now, as soon as this plant is completely dead, that parasite is nothing more to feed off of, and it's going to die. And this is the main difference between parasitism and predation. Parasites just feed off their hosts. They don't want to kill their host, because if they kill their host, then they're necessarily not going to be able to live anymore. Whereas predators want to kill their prey as fast as possible, because the longer their prey's alive, the more energy they're expending, and therefore less energy they're going to get overall from the meal, and the more chance they have of hurting themselves. Venus flytraps, predator prey. It wants to kill whatever insect it catches ASAP, versus these organisms, mistletoe. A lot of people don't know that mistletoe is actually a plant parasite, and even more people don't know that mistletoe is actually native to North America. There's over 300 species of mistletoe in North America. If you ever look up in a tree and you see these little dots in the tree like that, thicker areas of branches, those aren't branches, that's mistletoe. Mistletoe doesn't want to kill this tree, because as soon as this tree dies, this mistletoe is going to die too. It just wants to embed its roots in this branch and suck the nutrients from the tree as long as it can. Organisms also play unique roles in their ecosystem. And there's two unique roles that plants play. The first is a keystone species. These are organisms that are so important to their ecosystem, they basically create their ecosystem. The ecosystem without them would be totally different or non-existent. A good example of this would be elephants in savannas. Elephants are actually keystone predators in savannas, and that's because when acacia trees start growing in savannas, elephants will literally push them over, not only to eat their leaves, but also to clear room for more grasslands to grow. If elephants stopped doing this, if they weren't elephants to do this, then all the savanna grasslands would be covered by acacia trees, and the grasslands would be converted to a forest, and that ecosystem would cease to exist, the grasslands, that is. Keystone species shouldn't be confused with dominant species, the most common organism you see in an environment. Here's a forest. Our dominant species obviously is plants, specifically trees. And those aren't the keystone species in this environment, believe it or not. I mean, you could have a case where sometimes a keystone species and a dominant species is the same thing, but more often than not, a keystone species just keeps the ecosystem in check rather than just create the ecosystem as a whole. This area would still be a temperate forest. It would still get the same amount of sunlight and rainwater if these trees cease to exist. And organisms may change, but certainly that forest would still be alive. It would just be taken over by hardwood trees, or it would be taken over by softwood trees, or it would be taken over by large bushes, etc., etc., etc. Dominant species are usually not keystone predators. So, what do plants compete for? Light, nutrients, space to grow and live. And because they compete, they don't grow so well, or as well as they could have if they weren't competing. They avoid becoming prey, plants do, by producing chemicals or thorns or leathery leaves. And actually, plants have been avoiding becoming prey in these ways for so long that a lot of times their predators and their prey, in this case insects and plants, have co-evolved to each other. We end up in this arms race where one organism changing causes the other organisms to change as well. Plants also interact with organisms in their environments via mutualism, where they both benefit, commensalism, where one benefits, the other is unaffected, or parasitism, where the parasite benefits and the host is hurt but not killed. Mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism are symbiotic relationships. The difference between keystone and dominant species. A keystone species in an ecosystem is an organism that without which the ecosystem would basically cease to exist or change dramatically. Keystone species examples of that would be something like I said, an elephant in a savanna grassland. Keystone species are often predators, too, that keep their prey in check from overgrazing. For instance, jaguars keep deer in check in the upper Northwest America. And as a result, deer don't overgraze, they don't become overpopulated, and you get forests that jaguars live in. Jaguars are a keystone species. Not to be considered a dominant species because there certainly isn't more jaguars in those woods than there are trees or other plants. So dominant species, the organisms that there's more of than any other organism in the ecosystem, can be but isn't always necessarily a keystone species. All right, stay tuned for the next lesson. We're going to leave population ecology and some community ecology behind, and we're going to start studying succession, how nature takes over an environment and changes it over time.